Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Aurum Deal Curry CXO Dialogues. Our webinar for today is Are Renewables Back in Vogue? Some of you may have attended webinars with us in the past. This is Sanjay Bansal, the Managing Partner at Aurum Equity Partners. We've been conducting a series of these webinars over the last many months with the objective of sharing our insights into certain sectors with experts. Today's topic, like I said, is Are Renewables Back in Vogue? And we have with us Mr. Sanjay Kumar, who is a energy and a power expert, spent most of his life in this business, and has been actively participating in the power energy sector in India. Sanjay will share with us perspectives on this sector with us today. As always, we've broken the webinar into two parts. The initial part is a very brief presentation. It's more a dialogue where, as we run through the presentation, we will interact with Sanjay through the entire presentation and seek his point of view. And at the end of which, we will leave some time for Q&A by the participants and the attendees. At that point in time, send your question on chat or raise your hand and we will take your question online. There are some questions we've received in advance. We will address them also in the course of the Q&A session. So once again, welcome to the webinar on Are Renewables Back in Vogue? Welcome, Sanjay. We see Sanjay was partnered with us. He is the ex-head of power at Kane India and ILFS, and prior to that, CRISIL. Sanjay, thank you for joining us. We come into context straight on the sector, and I want to put a context around this entire discussion today. India is a large power market, right, with globally with lots of demand and increasing demand. Sanjay, would you like to put in context the India power sector with specific reference to renewables?
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay Bansal. If we start, we have to see the perspective first. Let's look at the historical growth and where we stand today, and that sets the tone for renewable in the market. The very first point is that today we have capacities almost equally spread in the state sector, central sector, and private sector. So we have progressed a lot while adding capacities in the market when we started reforms in mid-90s or so. Although we are still very low on per capita consumption, which we see going forward, we also get boosted. However, at this point of time, you can see for historical reasons, for other reasons, there's definitely a skewing towards coal-based capacities. So that's the realistic scenario, and here we say that we going forward will move from here.
If you look at why renewables are in vogue in India, right, in the context of much spoken about green energy, in the context of availability, the problem we've been having in India on various counts in the power sector. Would you like to throw some light on why do you believe renewables are genuinely back in vogue and there's a need for renewables in the Indian context?
Well, if we start looking into the various pieces why renewable is in vogue, Fuel crisis is probably one of the things. Rising coal imports, domestic coal matters, has put a lot of pressure on the plant load factor of the capacities we have added in recent times. That's one of the things. The second part of the thing is on the positive side. If we look around the technology growth, if we look around, the cost parameters of the renewables, that is coming more conducive to the Indian market, because we are highly price and cost conscious. The third dimension which has been presented here, the first part, is the peak deficit. Now, peak deficit has been almost maintaining for 8 to 10% over the last couple of years. But this is very important, although peak deficit is also a factor of market segmentation. There are market developments happening. Some developments are already in place, few more are being implemented. But if we look at the renewable technology development, especially solar, for example, this has got a huge potential towards peak management, because we are going to see utility scale power plant. We are also going to see non-utility scale. We are also going to see, where we say that net metering kind of opportunities where people can set up rooftop solar. All that is coming in practice, and that is going to help towards peak deficit management, which in a way is very challenging for the overall unfolding of the sector. And then, of course, nobody can ignore that global warming is also one of the reasons, and one of the awareness, and of course the regulatory pressures which are building up. So everything put together, we are driving towards renewable in a much stronger fashion.
Sanjay, is there any one factor which you think will stand out, which we can say is the single most important factor which will impact the relevance of renewables in this country?
Well, I will not restrict to a single most, but if we say that what is the sparkling factor or the group of factors which is bringing us to this scenario, one is definitely management of uncertainties regarding fuel, regarding the peak management. And the other is energy access and a decentralized control. If we look into the energy market, the electricity market on an aggregate basis in the country, there are a lot of issues related to availability, cost, quality, the peak management. And now we are talking about, campaigns like Make in India. There are other issues also. The technology as it is available today is pushing even at the consumer level to look for a solution on its own. And the combination of these parameters are actually heading us towards renewables.
Sanjay, if you look at the global statistics in the context of renewable power, is it fair to say that globally renewables is making a serious dent in terms of its relevance in the world? Is it a new phenomena and much spoken about, courtesy campaigns like green energy, the need for having the whole global ambition, the global environment, the environment pertaining to our weather conditions? How do you see renewables in the context of global installations and global capacity creation?
Well, if you look at the statistics on an aggregate level, it will definitely give a skewed picture towards fossil fuels. And the reasons are very simple, because we have a diverse range of countries. We have EU countries, we have North American countries, we have African countries, we have Asian countries. So there is definitely a range of the kind of plans we have. Fossil fuels get skewed towards we are globally, but that's possibly not the right approach to look at where we are, because we'll have to a bit ring fence what is happening historically and what has been happening over last couple of years. So if you take out the developments over last few years and look at the capacities, the new capacities being added globally, you will definitely see a skew towards renewable energy and more towards solar and wind, as the statistics also shows. So globally, I mean, if we make a statement, we should look at this aspect that we are migrating towards a more renewable power charged world rather than being dependent on fossil fuels only. It is also driving from the fact that the cost per unit of electricity generated has also fallen over last couple of years, and that's becoming probably one of the major drivers towards shifting to renewable opportunities.
Sanjay, do you believe that in terms of the cost of energy for the various renewables, are we inching close to market acceptability in terms of what the market is willing to bear, generally speaking? Or do you think the costs still continue to be fairly high in context of or in comparison to fossil fuels?
Well, I think if we just compare the cost of generation per unit of electricity, and then if we compare line by line, possibly that would not be giving the complete picture. We need to understand how the electricity market gets structured. And in any given electricity market, which runs on a real-time balancing situation, a different type of generation capacity, whether nuclear plays a role or a coal plays a role or a gas-based combined cycle or the peaking power plant plays a role. Everybody has a place in the market, and there are certain things that the base load and peaking load and the management in your own hand towards your own cost management, all that needs to be seen together. And if we try to see it together, yes, the cost of generation for renewable would probably be seen higher than many of the other options. But if we look at the developments, it is falling consistently, number one. And number two, the market complexities which has made the peaking power high cost has forced the consumers to also look into their own options on renewables. And these are one of the few simple points where we are driving.
Sunny, if you look at the investments which have been going in the renewable sector over the last few years, as you would notice on the presentation, there are some visible skews. One being in favor of wind and solar, and second being that the quantum of investment over the last 10 years has actually increased 4 to 5 times. So from a 50 billion roughly in 2004-5, that number has gone to in excess of 250 billion in the current in the year gone by. And of course, bulk of this has gone to wind and solar. What is your key takeaway in terms of global renewable energy investment and capacity addition? Why is wind and solar getting bulk of it? And what is the reason why this large change is taking place?
Yes, there is a great skew towards solar and wind. But again, if we start analyzing, one is definitely a dependence and growth in technologies. But for example, biomass. Let's look at the biomass. Biomass again has some kind of dependence on the fuel availability and movement to the plant. While in case of wind and solar, uh, we are simply depending on the nature. And for the nature, we have a clear trend. If we have studied the locations and the markets properly, there's absolutely a clear trend. So the control on the project operations are in your hand, and external dependence gets reduced to that extent. Geothermal, the technology growth is still happening. Maybe there could be a skew in future, uh, and we see some growth there as well. And there are other form of renewable energy that's also happening, and we are seeing technology growth in those areas. But for the time being, if we restrict on the recent past, if we restrict as a time horizon, these are the two areas for the technological growth, and for the reason that you have reduced dependence, external dependence on other factors to generate efficiently. A lot of capital has moved towards this direction, which is primarily wind and solar.
Do you think you would have any perspective on, I mean, I guess it's prevalent in the rest of the industries, but the huge skew of investment in China versus the rest of the developing countries like Brazil and India? I mean, it's a factor of 10 times. Would you have any perspective on this?
Well, it's definitely one is overall growth story of China. If we start comparing between India and China, then one parameter definitely is the variation in the growth between China and India. But we also need to see one aspect, and that we can't ignore. China has been implementing environmental standards and has been raising consistently. And not just doing that, they have been forcing the phasing out of the old power plants gradually, moving towards renewable. And there they have indicated a much higher pace for several reasons than what we see in India. They have also moved their domestic manufacturing, research as well as manufacturing capacities substantially to substantially higher level. And that's where the availability and possibly affordability as well as cost versus availability has been better skewed in terms of in favor of the policymakers or the developers. And that's the reason. That's one of the reasons why China has actually taken a lead on that area. But gradually, as you see, India has also been over the last few years, especially the policymakers, even the industry has been quite responsive to moving to renewable energy sector for multiple developments, and we are catching up. We are fast catching up towards that.
You know, one of the startling things we see is the fact that with $250 billion plus of investment annually in the last few years taking place in the segment, the PVC activity has been muted. You know, last 2014, it was under $3 billion, which doesn't work out to, if I was to consider a concept of 25 equity and 75 debt in terms of capital structure, and therefore try to do a estimation of how much private equity went on the equity side is less than 5%. It seems abysmally low and small. Is there any reason you would attribute as to why private equity and VC in the renewable, which is a sunrise sector, burgeoning industry, much spoken about, has been so muted and small? And what's your view on this?
Well, I think this is a complex observation to make. But if I speculate, if I'm allowed to speculate, possibly one of the things here which I think is hidden behind the numbers, that maybe it's talking about the initial investments by PE and VC and not entering at a later date, which means buying out the already developed opportunities. That could possibly be one of the parameters. But the other fact which sounds a little logical to me, that since the technology has been fast growing, the market has been changing and responding to the changes much faster. And by virtue of these two and few more parameters, I mean, basically removing the bottlenecks, this has been in a very dynamic situation. And if we know the PE and VC, possibly they prefer to look into a kind of trend, a kind of stabilized environment before they start jumping in the investment opportunities. I don't know whether the answer is right or wrong, but possibly this could be one of the reasons why statistics remain skewed, why there is a small component from PE and VC into the renewable sector investments.
Something which I will also go back and, both reconfirm and evaluate. And we tried to do that even before this session. And some of it could be the fact that per se power projects have gestation, policy matters, often driven by, some special incentives granted by governments, and therefore they've not been fully free and have found favor with the more with the early stage investors, but it's something which I think is changing, at least in the Indian context. I think the interest level is becoming visibly apparent for larger investments. I guess we'll talk about it in the course of the next few slides, but I think there's a changing thing over here. If we look at India, and it seems that India is geographically blessed, right? For a change, the sun gods are shining on us, and as they say, the winds are blowing along with us, and that is giving a much impetus to the renewable energy. If that was not the case, maybe all the Surya Namaskars done by the Indian yogic fan following is bringing fruit to bear in the context of the irradiation we enjoy in this country. In the context of this geographical benefit, what perspective would you have that, how good are these statistics, and do you think that our geographical status is really secure and good, and therefore we can continue to enjoy the benefit of solar and wind energy if we have the right markets, policy making, and good projects?
Well, there should not be any specific comment on exact capacity, because the scientists and the intellectuals might differ on the way it is evaluated and way it is calculated and arrived at. But the broad strategic points, if we start looking at, the fact remains that there is a huge capacity or the sunlight potential in the country. And given the technological developments and the capacity to capture that sunlight to convert into electricity, there is definitely a huge capacity in the country. I would not prefer to comment whether this is 1,000 gigawatt or this could be 2,000 gigawatts, but the simple fact remains that we have been blessed with a good quality of solar radiation. As you see, look at the numbers in Germany being 2.9 and India being 5.1. We are almost double. So capacity remains. We have not utilized or we have not started harvesting that for several reasons. But I don't think there has to be any question mark on the potential what we have in both solar as well as wind. Again, on wind, the technological progress has been quite significant, but there is slight challenge in terms of evaluating the wind capacity in the country. It is land sensitive, and we need to actually study a specific site for a few years before a commercial investment should be made. And land, as we all know, is a bit of sensitive matters. So there the challenge has been a little more complex as compared to solar. But again, the broad generic facts which has come out of several of the scientific analysis and the judgment by various of the agencies that we are still left with a huge wind power potential. And all that leaves a canvas of opportunities for potential investors to come and start looking at the country, because the growth percentage or the growth rate should be expected to be much higher as compared to other places.
Are there other specific states in India or any visible geographic locations in India where the solar energy stands out, like you have in the case of wind, where certain states enjoy the benefit of energy potential much more than the others? So, in the Gujarat context, or in the Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, we know that these are states which have stated and demonstrated potential in the wind energy side. Would there be any such locations in the Indian context vis-a-vis solar?
That's a good point. There are various ways to look at this aspect, actually. If we look into the strength of radiation, yes, there will be a radiation chart spread across the entire country. But that's not just the sole factor for developing a solar power park. If we start looking at solar, possibly we have to look into two dimensions, actually. One could be a utility scale, another could be a non-utility scale or a distributed generation opportunities. Incidentally, that is not exactly one-to-one comparable for the wind sector. So we and this is more land sensitive from a solar park development perspective. So yes, we'll have one of the best radiations in probably Rajasthan, and in terms of land mass availability, which could be put to the best use as solar power park, could be better there. But looking into looking into that dimension would not be sufficient. Solar has a huge potential to spread and to be considered for investment across the country. And especially if we start talking about non-utility scale, I think it is non-restrictive. One can look into any geography and terrain in the country where people could start looking into solar as one of the investment opportunities.
Sanjay, the Indian renewable energy perspective with 28 gigawatt of power capacity today, and the huge impetus on clean energy in the country, both in the wind and solar side more specifically. If we look at ourselves in the context of globally what's happening vis-a-vis solar and wind, and if we look at us in context of the trend of cost, both in terms of capex and cost of generation, what is your view both on how India is behaving on the renewable side vis-a-vis global, and how do you see this trend continuing going forward? What's your perspective?
Well, if we start comparing with one of the best markets, for example, Germany in renewable, especially in solar, we are still lagging far behind. But there could be reasons which are more of local in nature rather than global in nature. One, we have been we have started responding to renewable, especially non-wind renewable, much later. And two, various policies interventions which were required to give a boost to, say for that matter, solar power generation, I would say that came a bit late. So we are definitely lagging behind, but if we start looking into the recent developments in terms of policies and the thrust by government, I think we should be moving towards catching up on that difference very fast. We are now trying to discourage import and mining of coal by creating a cess. So definitely that's one parameter. We are forcing utility to buy renewable as a certain percentage, and that also we are trying to define and we're trying to implement in a more stringent way. That will also change the game. The falling prices of per unit of cost of electricity through the renewable opportunities. These numbers, what we're seeing here, I think these are all indicative. These are all moving in a very dynamic setup. But a very broad statement that cost per unit of electricity is falling down for renewables. The policies are changing from not clear to not so favorable to favorable position. And with all these combinations, we are seeing that we would soon be catching up towards more and more investments and development of renewable opportunities in the country.
Is there a capex per megawatt, or equivalently, is there a cost of generation per kilowatt, which you think is like a turning point for renewables to make the game change in favor of renewables totally? So the question is that at what level of you think capex cost or operating cost will the tide turn in favor of renewables and accelerate the growth on a radical basis in favor of renewables?
Well, I think
this is your hunch.
Well, I think capex or a parameter which talks about per megawatt of capacity ideally should not be the right parameter to compare, because if you look into various type of power generation opportunities, plant load factor, the limiting factor by which you can generate number of units varies widely. For example, if we are talking about coal and gas, we can go very comfortably up to 98%. But if we are talking about solar PV, maybe 20 to 25%. If you're talking about wind, maybe with a ceiling of around 25 to 30% has to be considered. So capex per megawatt is ideally not the right parameter to compare. The parameter should be at what cost per kilowatt hour we are getting electricity if we are trying to segregate them in terms of solar or wind or biomass or any other format. And that is possibly one of the key parameters to compare. But I would say again that should not be, and that is not sufficient and necessary reason to get into renewable or not get into renewable. Because if we extend this discussion, that today we are seeing we are moving towards a market-based power procurement system. The wholesale is already competitive, and it is gradually being brought down to retail level. And then market will be segmented on a peaking and a non-peaking or off-peak system. The numbers that will start getting thrown out of that, and people will individually will start comparing on those numbers. That's one. Second is, of course, quite important, the availability of electricity in interiors or at your locations. If we are not getting the grid capacities for several reasons there, maybe people will move towards solar and say that, yes, I'm getting it from solar power. So cost is not a sole factor, but if we look into broad statistics, I think gradually we are moving to a very comfortable situation where the Indian consumers are moving towards affordable range of electricity from renewable sector.
I think you put an interesting perspective on the market context of what I'm calling is Indian energy markets. And, given the geographic spread in India, the fact that there will be a lot of conventional power from thermal-based projects which don't reach the ultimate consumer, be it the retail consumer on the rural side, be it the large industrial setups in the backward area, which in turn helps develop the Indian, industry and economy as such. For the government to ensure that these energy markets develop well, and those are more relevant to look at than pure capex and cost of generation, right? What do you think is the government putting in terms of incentives or support mechanisms to make renewables relevant?
I think we can see that from the list. We are gradually drifting towards, as I mentioned earlier, where policy makers are also playing a role. For example, accelerated depreciation was introduced for wind power long ago, and certainly we saw a lot of interest for the developers and the investors to invest into wind power generation capacities. We have recently introduced, and in fact, in a way, we are migrating from accelerated depreciation to generation-based incentives, and that's another reason which is, again, enthusing the developers that we should get into renewable. In some cases, to promote renewable, we are also introducing viability gap funding. This I personally see as a temporary phenomenon because we will see the capex also going down gradually with the technological development. But since this mechanism is available, a lot of people, a lot of companies, a lot of investors and developers will start considering and are considering towards that. Renewable purchase obligation is the market-based phenomenon, I will say, which will be gradually and going forward will be more and more stringent, which means a certain percentage from say 10 to 20% over the next 7 years. Every DISCOM or every consumer who is availing of the open access benefits will be forced, will be compelled as per rule to make the procurement out of renewable. And this is the true market mechanism introduced through a policy intervention. And this is going to create a huge market as it becomes more and more stringent. There's the investment happening into this area. Many of the people may not get into those renewable purchase obligations, so they'll have to, or they will end up buying renewable energy certificates to meet their obligation, and that in turn is going to develop a market for renewable energy certificates, a deeper market for renewable energy certificates, which in turn again will attract capital to flow into this segment. Feed-in tariff is another area which has to be implemented a little more emphatically across various types of renewables. It does exist in certain parts or several of the states, limited to a type of generation, but that's also quite conducive wherever it has been implemented. We are also moving towards, for example, in case of solar on a net metering system. That's again another policy intervention which is going to help investing into capacities.
Are there any incentives among these various support mechanisms to create this energy market in India, which actually will help energize or incentivize renewable sector in terms of viability? Is there any one of these which you think stand out in terms of relevance from an economic return point of view?
I will choose any one of the parameters. I would rather prefer to choose at least two of them. One is a renewable purchase obligation, which is a market-making phenomenon. I will say this will be used, or this is being used as a market-making phenomenon, which means we are trying to carve out a market for renewable. And that's where if you create a market, if you create demand, supplies do enter into the market, capital does flow to create those supply options. That is definitely one of the prominent parameters. The other one, I would say that, the moment we move towards more towards net metering and feed-in tariffs, we are going to see a lot of positive move towards investments in this sector.
You mentioned net metering, and obviously it's not a mechanism fully in place today. One is familiar that smart metering is still at a test stage despite so many reports and thought process by the government over the number of years. I believe the first really serious project will go on steam only now, and also at a test pilot stage. Would there be any, for lack of a better word, additional support mechanisms or incentives which are prevalent in the rest of the world, which you think are ignored or not considered by the government in India to give impetus to the energy market in renewables? Or do you think more or less we cover the key aspects?
I think we are now moving towards being more aligned towards the global phenomena. For example, the countries which offered feed-in tariff for solar power generation opportunities, they progressed probably faster than us. And we are also realizing that, and gradually we are moving towards that. So I would rather be positive and say, yes, we are now gradually aligning to what is being offered globally. I'm not talking about the financing market, but I'm just talking about what could happen from the policy makers in the electricity sector. I think we are moving towards more globally aligned system than anything else.
There has been a lot of activity by the government in terms of what is called policy actions. Like everything else, the perception always builds inside whether on the seriousness or the implementability of these policy actions. Could you share your own practical perspective on, which of these do you think will see light of day and therefore impact, as we said, the energy markets in India?
Well, look at the last bullet point. Electricity Act 2003 was really a path-breaking initiative. There were a few provisions where we have lacked in terms of timely implementation, but lately we have realized that all those need to be implemented faster to realize the benefits out of the renewable revolution, I'll say. The last one, the cess, a kind of cess, introduced on coal imports, is another demotivator through a market-based mechanism. Basically, what we are trying to do is we are trying to enhance the cost of power generation on one hand, and another hand we are trying to create a pool of fund which can possibly subsidize the cost of generation, cost of per unit of generation via renewable options. So broadly, I will say that in terms of policies, we are considering options to promote renewable. There would definitely be a lot of on-ground issues which I don't think we should be making a generic statement like the green corridors or the transmission constraints. But I would say that individual cases have to be looked into, try to fit into the current electricity market structure, and then one has to take advantage in a very smarter way to invest in renewable and get the project implemented.
I'm going to move a little faster on a couple of slides. Ladies and gentlemen, and attendees at the webinar, for the time we're running now, we have seen a fair bit of investments in renewables. Although we would notice that the recent or relatively recent impetus by people like Sun Edison, top 5 solar energy player, or Gamesa, which is a global wind power player, hopefully will give further fillip to global investment of global MNCs or global players looking at India more seriously. But you would notice clearly that fair amount of Indian players have started looking at this segment, both from a funding as well as a developer perspective. I think the general view is that this will only further increase in India's favor on the renewable side. You notice that over 250,000 megawatt of green energy commitments have already been made as of the Reinvest 2015, and therefore much is expected to happen in the sector on the investment side. There are a fair number of equity options in the market through various agencies on the debt side as well as on the equity side, with only one caveat, that while there's a large canvas of funding, really on the equity side, serious private equity has not happened. It's more few transactions which have been visible. Also, I think exits of early investments are still happening. We saw what happened in the case of Inox Wind, and therefore these examples will create further interest in the sector. On the debt side, some realignment of policy making by the banks, given what is the experience on the energy side or on the power side, on the thermal power side, will give a further fillip to lending by the banks. The ecosystem is moving in the right direction. The canvas is in place, but I think there's an element of financing which is desired. Also, given the risk India associates or finances associated with projects in India, the risk weightage tends to be higher and therefore impacts the cost of capital or cost of debt, as the case may be, more linked to the construction, the development side of the project than otherwise. Something which I want to throw to Sanjay. Sanjay, any perspective on key challenges for renewables in the country?
I think one of the most prominent one I'll put in terms of policy side is possibly renewable purchase obligation needs to be implemented on a fast track, on a very stringent basis. And on the other side, one has to take care of the financing options, because if anybody analyzes the overall cost of power generation from renewable, substantial portion will go to financing cost as well. So I would rather keep these two as prominent restrictive parameters than anything else.
All right. What you just said actually echoes when we did a comparison. We tried to put this in context of India and US, where we looked at both solar and wind and looked at on a base of 100, what benefits and costs India enjoys. And at least in solar, it seems that, despite lower capex and because of the lower output or the higher finance, the levelized cost of energy becomes much higher in the Indian context for solar. Although in the case of wind, we have a slight benefit. But in both the cases, we noticed that our financing cost is significantly higher, which if lowered would make India actually one of the most attractive markets in the world in terms of levelized cost of energy on a base of 100, vis-a-vis US or some such market. We noticed that in India there is a lot of issues. which impact, as you rightly said, don't look at cost in isolation, look at cost of energy markets, which is linked to policy, thermal costs, subsidies, overall development, financial health of our discoms, the whole RPO, obligation fulfillment. Uh, what is your view? Is there how does one break away from this vicious cycle? Is there a light at the end of the day, or you know because unless are we going towards the same way the thermal was going, which is that unless this whole ecosystem cleanses itself up, really renewables will not take off, irrespective of cost of levelized cost of energy or capex. Any perspective, Sanjay?
I think I'll just highlight one point that may or may not apply to all forms of renewable energy, but it does apply to the most prominent form of renewable energy, and that is solar. It differs distinctly or from any other options. Why? Because this power in the hand of individual consumers. In most of the cases, the solution was wholesale. This is one option of renewable which is coming in the hand of consumers, where the solution could also be retail, which means each and every consumer, irrespective of the policymaker, the banks, financial institutions, and several other factors like grade or whatever we call it, he is able to take a decision whether he wants to move towards that or not. So this is definitely going to be one very, very prominent parameter which is going to bring the renewable revolution investment in the country.
We try to analyze the M&A and the private equity activity in renewables over the last few years. And like I was saying earlier, while the activity is apparent as we see on the number of transactions happening, it's been more recent. So the activity over the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, 14, 15 more visibly, has been much more than ever before. I think in the overall context of M&A or private equity, in terms of overall market, we know that 40 to 50 billion dollars of M&A happens in India every year, cross-border and domestic both put together, at an average, hopefully going up. And likewise, we see private equity and VC activity of about 10 billion at an average. The renewable sector still is commanding a very, very small share. Is there any perspective, Sanjay, that do you see more people talking to you on showing interest in the sector? We getting more inquiries, or people calling on showing keenness in renewables, both on the investment side as well as acquisition side. Do you echo a similar point of view?
While we are doing this webinar, I got an SMS from secretary of a residential colony in Jaipur who met last week, and he's reminding that when do we talk about a renewable energy solution for the colony. Now, this is just one example where people are getting aware and consumer is standing up looking for an option. And this is why I always feel that the moment market starts asking for a solution, you start seeing the change at a much faster pace. What can government can introduce?
And then finally, what's your outlook on renewables in India? What do you think are the good and the bad things, which will impact the renewable sector in this country?
Well, in terms of renewable project implementation, if we are talking about the large plants, the land survey and acquisition of land comes on front, but I have seen investors and developers who spend significant amount towards, not amount in terms of rupees, but amount in terms of the time and efforts towards resolving that issue, are able to do it quite efficiently. But on the negative side, I do see the financing structure and the options for financing, the local financing especially, If we don't drift away for that, possibly we'll not have the best renewable revolution in the country. Although on a positive note on this negative aspect, we are seeing a lot of developers and investors and suppliers linking their external debts and finances, extended tenure and lower interest cost to get into this large market. This is bringing solution to a certain extent. And these are the two aspects where we see things will be driven, and since combined with the fuel issues which the market is going to witness, which is on the negative side, but that's going to work on a very positive note to renewable energy investments and development in the country.
And if I was to ask you one final binary question, we've had a number of revolutions in India, Green Revolution and, the whole Operation Flood on the dairy side, milk side. Do you think we are at the cusp of a green energy revolution in India?
I think a very strong yes, we are. And this is what I'm personally seeing from the developments over the last as late and early as 12 months. We are seeing a very high level of awareness at all levels, and we are seeing a very high level of push at all levels where we are going to see this kind of revolution in the country.
Okay, Sanjay, thanks for your inputs. All participants, we've tried to make this into a more discussion-based, webinar, so that we could address some of the questions which some of you may have had. But like I said, we are running against time now, but I'll be open to some questions which any of you may have in the context of this discussion. I'm going to read out a couple of questions which have come to us. Like I said, some questions came to us earlier. We addressed them as part of this whole discussion. So Dinesh Kaura asks, we are a startup solar power developer in Chittoor district, Andhra Pradesh, looking for debt at interest rates between 3 to 5% per annum. Will you be able to provide us the information how it can be availed? I think the expectation on cost is very fine. There are some schemes of the government on lower cost, but I don't think these rates are really available unless we have some special subsidies on the project. Dinesh is to write to us independently. We can possibly try and come back to you on more specifics on looking at your project in question. There's a question from Runa Mukherjee. Do you see foreign investment, institutional investment coming from renewables? I think, like I said, there's a clear yes. There is a lot of interest which is coming in. Now, I want to differentiate FII from private equity. You find FII more on the listed side. There are fewer listed players in India on the renewable side, but we saw what happened to Inox Wind. Inox Wind's IPO was oversubscribed multiple times and listed itself at a premium to what they envisage as the offer price. So that is a recent reflection to you of how developers see in this market. Another question, are there PE firms who can help? From Dinesh, yes, there are a number of PE firms who are showing interest in renewables. I would only say that the cost of money from a return standpoint by a PE is higher. The capital structure has to be well thought through in terms of debt equity, at what stage you're taking the money, the risk associated to get a right return mix. But there's enough and more money chasing renewables in this country. There's a question from Sundaresh Subramaniam. Are the current set of rates mentioned in the PPAs affordable for PE players to invest, given the fact the rates are INR and the funds need to hedge the risk as well? Sanjay, would you like to take that?
Well, I think we need to do a detailed analysis rather than giving a generic comment. But I would say yes, there would be there's a need to give a careful look on the structuring and all related aspects before we commit to a particular structure and the rate and the PPA or the power sales strategy or the capex. One has to do that carefully, and I would make a generic comment that yes, that's possible. Only thing one has to look into every aspect very, very carefully and structure the project accordingly.
There's a question from Ashutosh Khale. The rate of growth of wind and solar generation is forecasted at 3% and 5 to 7% nominal by EIA in US. What is your perspective on how much different growth rate India see in these two industries? Sorry, this is something we have to cross check, but I can tell you one thing for sure. The number of years is double digit and upwards. We'll come back specifically to you on this article. There's a question from Sunil Agarwal. What type of PVC opportunities we have for other developers stroke RE power generation? So there are people who invested into India in the wind side, essentially driven by tax benefits. They've realized the potential of this, and I think some of them are trying to create full opportunities or businesses around this, right? There are, with the changing dynamics, incentives, ecosystem on renewable side, with the changing economics of capex and cost, operating cost per megawatt or per kilowatt of power generated in favor of consumers or more palatable, you are finding many more projects coming up. So I would say that there is enough and more happening in the market, right, which will increase and make projects attractive. I don't want to go into specifics, but there's enough appetite and perspective on PVC opportunities. There's a question from Sulakshana Pundle. Is government supporting such organizations, and why is it difficult to exit for Ps? Is it because of huge investment payback? I can answer the second question, and that is more because the P investment came inside when there was much, positivity on the power side and the Indian market. We all know that the Indian market went through a fairly rough period, both on the energy sector for both thermal and non-thermal, i.e. renewable, plus more importantly, went through a rough time on India's perception in the markets. Exits per se for private equities became a challenge across sectors, as a result of which renewables also suffered. Unless you create few success stories for people in the world who invest, unlike fresh capital chasing it. I think people have seen some of that now, are seeing more of that now. I think with more exits this year, hopefully they'll see many more going forward, and that will attract much more capital. So exits is an extremely important phenomenon for getting capital attracted to the sector. Avinash Nayak asks us a question: how do we reduce the high debt finance cost and remain competitive globally? Avinash, great question, but it has multiple aspects. It is a question of, firstly, your capital structure. Secondly, at what stage are you getting money from where? Do you get the debt, overseas debt at the initial stage or at the later stage? Do you get it to fill in the gap? So I think it's very important to, even in your debt financing, purely saying I'm borrowing debt is not enough. You have to break up your debt in context of sources. and the costs associated with it, which is in a way a direct function of your project, your PPAs, your risks on the construction and the development of the project, and all these impact your cost. So I think project planning, I'm a great believer. Project planning is a huge impact on your cost of borrowing on the project. It's a very, very key element. Other than that, obviously one keeps looking at new and more attractive sources, which means that, if you could get some multilateral, debt, for example, you're probably going to reduce cost. Sometimes you can bring a social angle into that picture of getting that benefit. So I think the question is more in context of, like I said, project to project. Participants, ladies and gentlemen, we have ran beyond our time frame. I think we've answered most of the questions, right? I once again thank you for participating in the webinar. The presentation will be available to this audience and more. Look forward to joining you or to having you once again on our next series of webinars on another topic. Thanks very much. Thank you, Sanjay, for your participation, and thanks to all of you for your participation.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.